It was past midnight in Green Bay, and an actual NFL general manager was on the phone, not angry, not bitter, but genuinely confused. He had one question that nobody in the league could give him a clean answer to: how is he still on the board? He was talking about Shedeur Sanders, a quarterback that multiple scouts had ranked in their personal top 3 at the position, a player with more college starts than anyone in the history of college football. And yet, on day 3 of the 2025 NFL Draft, he was still sitting there, waiting. The pick came at number 144. Round 5. That phone call did not happen after the draft wrapped up, it happened during it, in real time, as front offices across the league watched something unfold that defied every conventional expectation. And what that GM told Tom Pelissero in that midnight conversation pointed back, not to the combine, not to pro day, not to any on-field workout, but to a single podcast comment Deion Sanders made in early 2024. That one detail changes the entire frame of this story. Before getting into the reasons behind what happened, the sheer size of the gap between expectation and reality needs to be established, because it is genuinely shocking. Going into the 2025 NFL Draft, the quarterback conversation in most media circles was framed as a two-man race at the top, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. That was the debate on television, on podcasts, and in fan forums everywhere. Ward represented the arm talent, the mobility, and the physical upside. Sanders represented accuracy, poise, a winning record at 2 separate programs, and one of the most recognizable bloodlines in the sport. Mel Kiper Jr., one of the most respected draft analysts in the history of the business, had Shedeur ranked as his number 1 quarterback. Bucky Brooks, another respected and credentialed voice, agreed with that assessment. These are not casual observers, these are professionals who spend their careers studying this process full-time. And yet, here is what Tom Pelissero, a reporter who speaks directly and regularly with every front office in the NFL, said after the draft concluded: the Cam Ward versus Shedeur Sanders debate was a media creation, not a league reality. That needs a moment to land properly. The conversation that dominated sports television for months, the debate that analysts were dissecting and fans were arguing about, apparently was not happening inside NFL buildings in the same way at all. Inside the league, Ward was the clear QB1. After Ward, the conversation was not Shedeur Sanders versus the field. It was Shedeur Sanders, Jackson Dart, Tyler Shaw, and Jalen Milroe, all grouped together, in different orders on different team boards, with no real consensus among evaluators. That disconnect between the public narrative and the private reality inside front offices is the first piece of the puzzle. But it only explains part of what happened. One element of this story that does not receive nearly enough attention is the fact that Shedeur Sanders did not hire an agent. That is his legal right, no player is required to have one. But agents exist for reasons that go well beyond contract negotiation. They exist specifically to navigate the kind of pre-draft process that Shedeur went through, the formal interviews, the informal meetings, the 32 different conversations with 32 different organizations that each have different cultures, different internal priorities, and different evaluation standards beyond what is visible on game tape. Agents prepare their clients for those meetings through mock interviews and coaching on body language. They manage which teams receive FaceTime and which receive phone calls. They make sure every organization, even the ones a player has no desire to play for, walks away from an interaction feeling respected. Because in the draft process, a team that feels disrespected does not simply pass on a player. They talk. Shedeur went into this process modeling the approach his father used. Deion Sanders famously operated during his playing career by dictating his own terms, making clear to teams what it would cost to acquire his services, and refusing to cooperate with organizations he had no interest in joining. That is legendary behavior, and it worked for Deion because he was a generational talent at a position that did not require the same kind of organizational integration that quarterback demands. Quarterback is fundamentally different. It is the one position in the NFL where teams are not just evaluating whether a player can perform, they are evaluating whether they can build around him, trust him with the entire organization, and manage the relationship for a decade. Multiple reports that emerged from Shedeur's pre-draft meetings with teams used language that was striking not just for its content, but for its consistency. People from completely separate organizations, with no reason to coordinate messaging, reached for the same phrase, "worst meeting of all time." When that kind of language appears across multiple independent sources, it is not a coordinated leak. It is a shared experience. Tom Pelissero traced the specific origin point of the pre-draft process breakdown back to something Deion Sanders said on a podcast in February or March of 2024, more than a year before draft weekend. The comment, paraphrased, was this: if Shedeur or Travis Hunter were drafted by a team Deion did not believe was right for them, he would pull an Eli, a reference to Eli Manning's famous refusal to play for the San Diego Chargers in 2004, and force his way out of that situation. That one comment, made casually on a podcast more than 12 months before the draft, apparently lived in the institutional memory of NFL front offices far longer than anyone in the Sanders camp likely realized. Because the calculation a general manager makes when he hears that is not abstract, it is immediate and concrete. If he spends a first-round pick on this quarterback, and that quarterback's father decides after the fact that the situation is not acceptable, the GM is now managing a controversy that existed before his player took a single regular season snap. He is potentially dealing with Deion Sanders going on national television and undermining his coaching staff's authority. He is absorbing a distraction he never asked for and cannot control. In a league where quarterbacks are simultaneously the most important and most expensive asset a franchise can hold, front offices have a near-universal allergy to uncontrollable variables. One podcast comment. Over a year old. Still being cited at midnight, during the draft itself, as a primary reason a top 3 quarterback prospect was sitting on the board in round 5. The narrative that emerged from the pre-draft meetings is not, however, the only story being told about Shedeur Sanders as a person, and that tension is important. Louis Riddick, a former NFL executive and one of the most credentialed voices in the broadcast space, said on record that every team passing on Shedeur was taking a serious gamble. He compared the potential career trajectory to that of Drew Brees and stated directly that there would be significant historical revision if Sanders develops into a star at the professional level. One analyst who spent genuine time around Shedeur during the pre-draft process offered a picture that contradicted the anonymous meeting reports almost entirely. He described every interaction with Shedeur as legitimately positive, including a moment where Sanders took time to talk to the analyst's kids on FaceTime. His conclusion was that the real problem was not Shedeur's attitude or character, it was the advice he received. That distinction carries real weight. There is a meaningful difference between a player who is genuinely difficult and a player who was coached, whether deliberately or not, into behaviors that registered as difficult to the people evaluating him. Every anonymous report about nightmare meetings could be accurate and still represent an incomplete picture of who Shedeur Sanders actually is as a person. But the NFL draft process does not offer second chances or opportunities to reframe. There is one interaction per team, and if those meetings produce a consistent negative impression across multiple organizations, the tape stops being the primary factor in the evaluation. Louis Riddick did not stop at the Drew Brees comparison. He invoked a name with a deeper historical resonance, Warren Sapp. Sapp entered the 1995 NFL Draft considered a potential top 10 selection. Anonymous pre-draft reports about his character caused his stock to collapse dramatically. 31 teams passed on him. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers selected him 12th overall, and he went on to become one of the most dominant defensive players in NFL history, a Pro Football Hall of Famer. The structure of what happened to Sapp, anonymous sourcing, coordinated character concerns, a pre-draft pylon that turned out to be at least partially inaccurate, carries recognizable patterns when placed next to the 2025 draft. Then Stephen A. Smith introduced a comparison that landed differently. He named Colin Kaepernick. Smith was deliberate about the comparison. He was not claiming the situations were identical, but his specific point was this: the NFL is a league where owners arrive at shared conclusions without requiring a formal meeting or organized coordination. When a player, or in this case a player's father, is perceived as a potential threat to the institutional control that ownership maintains over the league has historically found ways to express that displeasure. A former NFL scout articulated the underlying reality clearly: personal feelings enter draft rooms. Players get elevated because scouts like them personally. Players get pushed down because scouts do not. The process has never been a purely objective football evaluation. Shedeur Sanders ended up in Cleveland, and the circumstances of how he got there tell a story of their own. Eagles general manager Howie Roseman was asked directly after the draft about the pick. His response was careful and revealing in its precision. He said, "Everything you said is factual," and he refused to deny that Shedeur had been on Philadelphia's draft board. He confirmed that the Browns jumped ahead of them in the order. Shedeur Sanders was one pick away from joining the roster of the defending Super Bowl champions. That detail is not minor. Instead, he landed in Cleveland, in a quarterback room that includes Kenny Pickett, a former first-round pick, and Dillon Gabriel, whom Cleveland selected in the third round of this same draft. 3 quarterbacks. 3 different profiles. 3 different paths to the same building. Understanding what Cleveland is actually doing requires looking at the full picture of their draft strategy. The Browns traded down from the number 2 overall pick and collected a substantial return, including additional first-round selections, among them one in 2026. The 2026 draft class is projected to be meaningfully stronger at quarterback than the 2025 class. Arch Manning could be available in that cycle. There are multiple players currently in college football who project as legitimate franchise quarterbacks and will not be available for another year. Cleveland does not need Shedeur Sanders to be their permanent answer at the position. They need him to compete, to push the room, and to function as an affordable lottery ticket in a roster situation full of question marks. If he wins the starting job outright, that is a tremendous outcome. If he develops into a legitimate starter over the next 2 seasons, that creates valuable options. If he forces their hand before the 2026 pick can be used on a higher upside prospect, that is, in the language of NFL front offices, a good problem to have. This was not Cleveland acting out of desperation. This was deliberate asset accumulation planned across multiple draft cycles, with Shedeur as one calculated piece of a larger, longer strategy. Stating the conclusion plainly, because the noise around this story makes plain language necessary, Shedeur Sanders is not a 5th-round quarterback. Every scout, every analyst, and every general manager who went on record, including those who passed on him, acknowledged that what happened over 2025 draft weekend was not the product of a clean football evaluation. It was the result of a process that broke down under the accumulated weight of bad preparation advice, pre-draft meetings that left lasting negative impressions across multiple organizations, a podcast comment made more than a year earlier that never left the institutional memory of the league, and a professional culture that maintains a long and specific memory about anyone perceived as a challenge to its authority. Could the meetings have been as bad as reported? Yes. Could some of the character concerns have been legitimate? Probably some of them. Could personal feelings about Deion Sanders have influenced how evaluators approached his son's candidacy? Based on what multiple people inside the league said explicitly and on record, absolutely. Was the combination of all those factors enough to justify a 5th-round grade on a player that scouts privately ranked in the top 3 at the position? That is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the honest answer, drawn from the people who were actually in those rooms and on those phones, is no. The football evaluation supported a Day 2 selection at worst. Everything that pushed him past Day 2 and into Day 3 existed entirely outside the tape. And most of it was correctable. Cleveland's training camp opens in the summer, and the quarterback competition inside that building will be the most scrutinized competition in the entire NFL when it does. Not because of Kenny Pickett. Not because of Dillon Gabriel. Because everyone who watched what happened over draft weekend is waiting for the answer to the same question. Was this a lesson, or was it a mistake? If Shedeur Sanders walks into an NFL season as a legitimate starter, without his father on the sideline, without preferential treatment, earned through nothing but direct competition in a professional environment, then every team that passed on him in rounds 1 through 4 will have a very difficult internal conversation ahead. A GM was on the phone at midnight during the draft, genuinely asking how this was still possible. Howie Roseman would not deny that Philadelphia was next in line before Cleveland moved. A former scout said directly that the slide was partly personal. An analyst who spent real time with Sanders concluded the advice was the problem, not the person. If this story hit home for you, if you believe what happened to Shedeur Sanders over 2025 draft weekend demands a closer look and real accountability, hit that like button right now. And if you want to be here when Cleveland's training camp begins and the competition inside that quarterback room becomes the most watched story in the NFL, subscribe to this channel immediately. This is where every development in that building gets covered as it happens, with the same depth and the same commitment to the facts that this story deserved from day one. The real story is just getting started.